Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. You guys have really outdone yourself this time with the source material. We're talking about the intersection of sustainability and risk management.
Yeah, it's a pretty crucial topic, wouldn't you say?
Ah,
And it's definitely a tangled web.
Oh, absolutely. So today we're going to try to cut through that complexity, get right to the heart of what matters most, really extract those actionable insights for all of you listening.
Think of this as your cheat sheet. We're going to break down why strong risk management isn't just like a nice to have when it comes to sustainability. It's absolutely essential.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Our primary source today is going to be ERM Chapter 8.5, Enabling Sustainability Risk by Pritesh Biswas.
Great source. Really smart analysis of this whole connection.
Yeah, he brings up some really good points.
So we're not just going to be asking, what is sustainability? We all kind of get that at this point, right?
Yeah.
We're going to be diving into how we actually get there. What are the roadblocks we could encounter? How do we anticipate them? How do we overcome them?
Right. And what are some of those unintended consequences that can pop up?
Exactly. And we're going to be exploring some kind of surprising aspects too. For instance, how risk management can actually bring together folks who have wildly different views on sustainability.
It's all about finding that common ground,
And of course, we're going to be diving into the concept of double materiality.
which is so important. It really helps make sense of this whole landscape.
Definitely key to the whole thing.
Yeah.
All right, let's kick things off by talking about this fundamental link between sustainability and risk management. I think it's pretty clear that going green isn't always, smooth sailing for companies. There are real challenges.
Totally. I like to think of sustainability kind of like a double-edged sword, right?
Okay, I like that.
On one side, you've got all this amazing potential, new markets opening up, innovation,
Hmm.
stuff like shifting to renewable energy sources. But on the flip side, there's the risk that comes with trying to adapt your existing systems, retrain your workforce.
Yeah, change is hard.
And that's exactly where risk management steps in. You've got to kind of sharpen that potential upside while also, blunting that blade of risk. It helps organizations really grasp both the rewards and the dangers of pursuing sustainability goals. And then, most importantly, it helps them manage them effectively.
See, and what strikes me is that sustainability is one of those issues where people have really strong opinions.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
You've got those who are really worried about, say, climate change. Then you've got those who might be more skeptical. How does a risk manager navigate that kind of polarized landscape?
That's such a great question. I think the best risk managers, they act like a bridge between those different perspectives.
I like that.
They focus on the potential impacts, both positive and negative, regardless of what people's beliefs are about the root causes. So instead of getting bogged down in arguments about, is climate change real or not, they say, okay, what if a massive storm hits? It's going to disrupt the supply chain. That's a risk we need to manage, regardless of our beliefs about the underlying cause.
Focusing on what affects the business, it makes a lot of sense.
Right.
And it seems like this connection between risk management and sustainability isn't just, a good idea in theory. It's actually becoming embedded in rules and guidelines,
Well,
right?
absolutely. Look at frameworks like the TCFD.
The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to dive into that a bit more later.
Okay.
But a core part of those guidelines is about ensuring companies bake climate-related risks into their overall risk management framework.
It's not just some separate thing they do on the side.
Exactly. Sustainability risks aren't off in their own little silo. They need to be right up there with the big ones, treated with the same rigor, and woven into that core risk framework, just like any other major business risk.
Sustainability is not a side hustle. All right, let's shift gears a bit and look at how risk management actually grapples with the massive scope of sustainability, particularly when we talk about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs.
Yeah, I mean, there are 17 of them.
It's a lot.
What's really cool here is how risk management gives us a structured way to look at each one. So for each goal, we ask two key questions. What good things could this bring about for our organization, for the world at large, and what negative things could happen?
So it's not just a matter of saying, goal number 4, quality education. That's good, right? It's about getting down into the weeds.
That is.
Really thinking about how achieving that specific goal could affect the company both positively and negatively.
Precisely. Let's take, for example, SDG 5, gender equality.
Okay.
A company might see a positive impact from, say, having more diverse leaders. Studies show that leads to better decision making, more creative thinking.
Right.
But there's also the potential for negative impacts.
Right.
What if there are accusations of unfair treatment based on gender in the workplace? That could lead to legal issues, damage the company's reputation.
Like,
Or think about SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities. There's a huge opportunity there to make construction projects more environmentally friendly, but also a risk of, contributing to water pollution through those same activities.
so even with the best intentions, there can be unintended consequences.
Exactly.
It's interesting how a single SDG can be both a potential win and a potential headache.
It's that duality.
Yeah.
And a risk manager is there to help navigate both sides of that coin.
They're walking that tightrope.
Another thing to keep in mind is that sometimes the actions a company takes to be more sustainable, they might not immediately translate to higher profits.
Right. It's not always about the bottom line in the short term.
But if you take that broader view, thinking about the long-term health of the company and its impact on the world around it, these actions can be incredibly strategically important.
So a company might say, you know what, we're going to use these more sustainable materials, even if they cost a bit more upfront, because it aligns with our values.
Exactly.
And in the long run, it's going to make us more resilient.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
And how a company approaches these SDGs often comes down to their main focus. Are they mainly trying to avoid the risks of not being sustainable?
Playing defense.
Or are they actively looking for opportunities that sustainability presents?
Playing offense.
And it's not always that clear cut, of course.
Right, there's a spectrum.
Plus, it's crucial to remember that different stakeholders, like investors, employees, customers, the local community, they might all have different ideas about what the company's role should be in achieving these global goals.
Which brings us nicely to this concept of social materiality. It sounds like it's about figuring out what truly matters.
You got it. Now, materiality is one of those words that gets thrown around a lot in the sustainability world.
A bit of a buzzword.
It can mean slightly different things to different people.
So we need to define our terms here.
We do. And for risk managers, understanding these nuances is so important for figuring out which sustainability risks and issues really deserve the most attention.
Where do we focus our energy?
Exactly. At its core, figuring out what's material boils down to two key questions. How do we decide what counts as important? And who is it important to?
Okay, so let's tackle that first question. How do we decide what counts as important? It sounds like there might be some similarities to how we assess traditional business risks.
There's definitely a parallel there.
Okay.
In traditional risk assessment, we often look at two main things. How bad could the impact of a risk be? And how likely is that risk to actually happen? So the most material risks are typically those with the biggest potential negative impact, or those that are both quite likely and pretty serious. Now, when we bring sustainability into the picture, what makes something important gets a lot broader. We can't just focus on, money or reputation.
Right, it's not just about the bottom line.
We also need to consider those environmental, social, and governance factors, the ESG stuff.
So something that might seem like a small environmental issue could actually be really important.
It could be.
If its potential to damage the environment is huge, even if it doesn't immediately hit the company's profits.
Exactly. Now let's move on to that second crucial question. Who is it important to? This is where dynamic double materiality comes into play.
Dynamic double materiality. Okay, that's a mouthful.
It is, right.
Break that down for us.
All right, so think about how we usually decide what's financially or legally important. Something is generally considered material if knowing about it would change a typical investor's mind, right? Or affect the judgment of a reasonable person,
That's the legal standard.
right? But with sustainability, the audience is much broader. We're talking employees, customers, local communities, regulators, NGOs, you name it. They all have their own sets of concerns and interests. Double materiality captures this wider view by looking at two connected things.
Okay.
First, how a sustainability issue affects the company itself, its ability to achieve its goals. And second, how the company's actions and impacts affect those external stakeholders and the world at large.
So it's not just about how, say, climate change might affect us as a business, but also how our operations contribute to climate change.
Precisely.
And how that, in turn, affects other people and the planet.
You got it. And the dynamic part of this concept, that just means that what these different groups consider important, it's not static.
It's a moving target.
It changes over time. Society evolves.
Right.
We learn more scientifically. Regulations change.
Okay, so we've got this complex picture of what's important and who it matters to. How do risk managers actually navigate this to focus on what you called Social materiality.
Focusing on social materiality, it starts with conversations.
Stakeholder engagement.
Exactly. Talking to different groups, both inside the company and those who are affected by what the company does. The goal is to understand which sustainability issues they consider most important. Typically, the company will rate how significant a set of issues is to them. And then they'll get external stakeholders to rate those same issues.
You compare the ratings.
Right. And that comparison helps pinpoint the issues that are most socially significant. Often, companies will use a tool called a social materiality matrix to visualize this. Usually, the sweet spot is the top right corner, issues that are highly important to both the company and its stakeholders. But BSWIS also highlights the value of looking at the top, left, and bottom right corners.
Okay, tell us about those.
The top left, that might be where stakeholders are really concerned about something, but the company doesn't think it's a big deal.
A blind spot.
Exactly. That could be a reputational disaster waiting to happen. The bottom right, on the other hand, might reveal areas where the company sees a significant impact, but stakeholders aren't really aware of it yet. Maybe the company needs to do a better job of explaining why it matters.
Transparency is key.
It really is. For risk managers, understanding and measuring materiality from these different angles is fundamental. It ties right back into those first steps of risk management. Knowing your business context, understanding what your stakeholders need and expect, identifying the risks and opportunities.
It's all connected.
It is. And there are 3 key takeaways for risk managers here. First, different fields have their own ways of deciding what's material. You need to be aware of those different approaches. Second, materiality is about understanding what truly matters and then actually doing something with that knowledge.
Taking action.
And third, you have to respect and incorporate the different viewpoints of your stakeholders when you're making decisions.
It's not just about what the company thinks.
Right.
All right, let's move on to this idea of emerging sustainability risks. It sounds like we're talking about the risks that aren't so obvious or well-defined yet.
Exactly. Thinking about emerging risks, it forces organizations to look beyond those typical timeframes. These risks are often new, they're complex, and there's a lot of uncertainty about the timing or how big the impact could be. And a lot of sustainability risks fall into this category.
It's like trying to predict the future, right?
Yeah, it is. And the danger with these emerging sustainability risks is that companies might be tempted to wait. They might say, well, let's wait until we understand it better. Let's wait until it becomes a more officially recognized threat. And while that might be okay for some risks with sustainability issues, it can be really dangerous.
Procrastination can be deadly.
By the time everything is crystal clear, it might be too late to do anything truly effective about the negative consequences. Climate change is the perfect example.
Yeah, we've all heard the warnings from scientists.
BSWIS actually cites projections of potential global temperature rises of 4 to 6 degrees Celsius by the 2040s. The potential consequences are pretty dire. Significant sea level rise, fertile land turning into desert, regions becoming uninhabitable without major technological interventions.
Those are some serious stakes.
They are. And the point is, if we wait until those impacts are fully upon us, we've missed the boat. We've lost the chance to prevent the worst outcomes.
Hence the global push for emissions reduction targets, getting to net zero by 2050.
Exactly. Those targets are about proactively managing a major emerging risk, even when we don't have all the answers. The logic is, waiting for absolute certainty could lead to irreversible and severe consequences for the planet and future generations.
So when it comes to these emerging sustainability risks, the key question isn't necessarily what is the risk, but when should we start dealing with it?
Exactly. We often need to take action even with incomplete information.
Which makes this idea of a just transition even more critical, right? If we're making these big shifts towards sustainability, we need to make sure it's fair.
Couldn't agree more. While aiming for all 17 SDGs is a noble ambition, the reality is that focusing really hard on one goal can sometimes unintentionally make it harder to achieve another.
They can be in conflict.
They can. BSWIS gives the example of aggressively pursuing climate action, SDG 13, potentially having negative effects on no poverty, SDG 1.
Right.
The just transition is all about navigating these potential conflicts fairly and in a balanced way, particularly as we transition to a low-carbon economy.
So it's not just about switching from, say, coal to solar power. It's also about what happens to the people who worked in those coal mines.
Absolutely. For some, the just transition is primarily about supporting workers in those industries that are going to be most affected by this energy transition, giving them training and opportunities in new, greener sectors. But the concept often goes beyond that. It looks at how this transition can be a lever for addressing broader societal inequalities.
Like wealth distribution, access to education, healthcare.
Exactly. It's about making sure the benefits of sustainability are shared widely, not just concentrated in certain areas or among certain groups. And risk management is essential here because it helps organizations identify and address those potential clashes between different sustainability goals.
Finding that balance.
Right. It's about weighing those trade-offs and making choices that lead to overall progress and fairness. A successful just transition involves several key steps. First, actively involving all the affected people in the decision-making process.
Bringing everyone to the table.
Then, planning and supporting workers in those transitioning industries, investing in creating new sustainable jobs, putting in place measures to protect vulnerable groups, and constantly monitoring and adapting strategies as the transition unfolds. And as Biswas points out, the risk management tools we already use, like horizon scanning, scenario analysis, emerging risk assessment, they can be really powerful for this broader strategic rethink around sustainability.
All of this talk about taking action, having a real impact, it really emphasizes the need for accountability, doesn't it? We hear so much about greenwashing these days.
Oh, yeah. Greenwashing is basically a term that captures the skepticism people have about companies that talk a big game about being environmentally and socially responsible. But really, they're just trying to look good, boost profits, without actually making meaningful changes.
It's all PR, no substance.
Exactly. And terms like sustainability itself, ESG, CSR, they often get caught up in this. So to be truly meaningful, sustainability efforts need to go beyond lip service. They need to focus on real actions and measurable results. From a risk management perspective, this means focusing on putting in place effective controls, not just gathering data and ticking boxes.
Right. It's not just about compliance.
It's about real change, and how we measure performance needs to be transparent and verifiable. While companies have often relied on self-assessment surveys and things like that, there's a positive trend towards using independent data sources, like satellite monitoring of emissions,
Getting that objective data.
which makes everyone more accountable, including investors who are increasingly incorporating ESG ratings into their investment decisions.
And they're keeping an eye on sustainability performance after they've invested, too.
Absolutely. And it's not just about environmental impact either. The case of Elon Musk and Tesla being removed from the S&P 500 ESG index, even though they make electric vehicles, that was really eye-opening.
A lot of people were surprised by that.
Musk called ESG a scam after that happened.
Yeah, he wasn't happy.
But it wasn't because their cars are environmentally friendly. It was because of concerns about their lack of a broader low-carbon strategy beyond their vehicles, allegations of discrimination in the workplace, safety issues with their self-driving systems. This shows that ESG ratings look at a much wider range of how a company operates.
It's about the whole picture.
Exactly.
Right.
So while having sustainability plans and standards is a good starting point, what truly matters is execution and real impact. Risk management is crucial for making sure those ESG targets are realistic, they have the resources behind them, and that companies are held accountable for actual progress, not just promises.
Actions speak louder than words.
Always.
All right, let's touch on how sustainability and resilience relate to each other.
Okay?
Sometimes it feels like those terms are used interchangeably, but it sounds like there's a crucial difference.
There is. In the past, yeah, they were often used as synonyms, but today they have distinct meanings.
Which can be confusing.
It can. ISO 22316, the International Standard on Resilience, defines it as an organization's ability to adapt to change, recover from disruptions, and continue achieving its objectives. Sustainability, on the other hand, is about making things better for the planet and society for future generations.
So a sustainable company is likely to be more resilient,
Probably yes.
but a resilient company isn't necessarily sustainable.
Not necessarily, no.
So resilience is more about being able to bounce back from problems, while sustainability is about having that positive long-term impact.
That's a great way to put it. The main difference in focus is that resilience is about survival. How well an organization can withstand those shocks and stresses.
Internal and external.
Right. Sustainability, on the other hand, it has a broader scope. It goes beyond just surviving to consider those positive and negative effects on both society and the environment. And this difference also shows up in how we think about what's important. Resilience is more about what affects the company itself, what's sometimes called single materiality. Sustainability, with its consideration of impacts on the world and vice versa, that embodies double materiality.
It's about the bigger picture.
It is.
All right, this feels like it's all leading up to the big one. Climate change.
Hard to talk about sustainability without talking about climate change.
It's the elephant in the room.
It is. So, managing risks related to climate change, that's a central part of sustainability risk management. And here, we need to focus on the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, or TCFD.
TCFD, we hear that a lot these days.
You do, and for good reason. It's become a really important driver for making those financial disclosures more transparent, especially after it was mandated in the UK following the COP26 summit in Glasgow in 2021.
And it's not just a UK thing anymore.
No, it's spreading.
It seems like other parts of the world are moving in the same direction.
Oh, definitely. The EU, Canada, the US, they're all developing similar frameworks, and it looks like they're going to be very much in line with TCFD. So, while there are other ways to report on climate-related issues, TCFD has become the main focus for these big shifts in how we disclose financial risks linked to climate change.
Can you give us a little bit of a history of how TCFD came about?
Sure, it all started back in 2015-2016 when the G20 finance ministers asked the Financial Stability Board to take a serious look at climate change as a risk to the global financial system.
Makes sense.
In 2017, TCFD released its initial set of recommendations, giving financial institutions a framework for identifying and incorporating climate risk assessment into their core operations.
So banks, insurers, investment firms, they all had to start thinking about how climate change could affect their investments.
Right. And then in 2020, the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a group of central banks, issued guidance on how to do long-term climate scenario analysis. We're talking looking out as far as 30 years.
Wow.
And then, as we mentioned, in November 2021, the UK government made TCFD reporting mandatory for all large companies.
So it's becoming the standard.
It is. And the TCFD framework itself is built around 4 key areas: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets.
All right, let's dive a bit deeper into strategy and risk management within that TCFD framework. Governance seems pretty straightforward.
Governance mandate really emphasizes that boards need to be actively involved in overseeing climate change issues.
Not just delegating it.
No, they need to be having those robust discussions, asking those challenging questions. And in companies that don't have dedicated sustainability committees, these responsibilities usually fall to the risk and audit committees.
Because those committees already deal with a lot of the company's major risks.
Exactly. They provide a natural place to connect those climate considerations with the broader risk landscape.
So it's about integrating climate into the existing risk management structure.
It is. And the key here is that those governance structures need to be tailored to the specific company. You can't just have a one-size-fits-all approach. Effective governance needs to align with and support the overall business strategy. Climate-related issues, there shouldn't be some separate project running off to the side. They need to be formally integrated into that core business strategy.
Mainstreamed.
Yeah, exactly. And this integration often happens through a continuous cycle.
Okay, what does that look like?
You start by assessing what's important and what the risks are. Then, you evaluate your controls and plan your actions. And then, you're constantly monitoring performance and refining the strategy. TCFD also specifically recommends scenario analysis as a key way to evaluate potential climate risks and inform those strategic decisions.
And when we talk about climate-related risks, TCFD breaks them down into 2 main categories, right?
They do.
Physical and transition risks.
Yes. Physical risks, those are the ones that stem from the actual physical changes happening because of climate change.
So rising sea levels, more frequent and intense droughts, extreme weather events, wildfires.
Exactly. Transition risks, on the other hand, are connected to the shift towards a lower carbon economy. So things like the introduction of carbon taxes, changes in insurance availability and affordability, new government regulations.
So it's not just about the physical impacts of climate change, but also the economic and regulatory changes that come with trying to address it.
Precisely. And while TCFD talks about these as risks, companies can absolutely use their standard risk management methodologies to assess both those potential threats and the emerging opportunities that come with the transition to a low-carbon economy.
So you can both mitigate the negative impacts and capitalize on the positive ones.
Exactly.
You mentioned scenario analysis as a key tool that TCFD recommends. What exactly does that involve when we're talking about climate change?
So TCFD suggests companies use scenario analysis to look at both the medium term, around 7 years out, and the long term, around 25 years out, to evaluate those potential climate-related risks and opportunities. And importantly, TCFD doesn't prescribe a specific methodology. They leave it up to the risk manager to choose the most appropriate approach for their organization.
So there's some flexibility there.
There is. Scenario analysis is really valuable when you're dealing with risks that are complex and uncertain, where those traditional risk assessment methods might not be enough.
Which is definitely the case with climate change.
Oh, absolutely. And a scenario isn't a prediction of what's most likely to happen. It's more like a plausible story about how the future could unfold under different conditions.
What if scenarios?
Exactly. Now, for climate change, the Network for Greening Financial Systems, NGFS, has developed a set of really well-regarded scenarios that a lot of companies use as a starting point.
Because they're based on credible data.
They are. And they align with other frameworks. But the real value of scenario analysis isn't just in creating those potential future stories, it's in the actions they lead to. The changes you make to strategic plans, the targets you set, and how you measure progress.
It's about turning insights into action.
Exactly.
All right, finally, let's talk about metrics and targets in the context of climate change. I imagine emissions are a pretty key metric here.
You'd be right. While sustainability encompasses a wide range of metrics, from water usage to impact on biodiversity, emissions are definitely a central focus right now.
Especially with all the talk about net zero.
And emissions are typically divided into 3 scopes. Scope 1 covers those direct emissions from sources that the company owns or controls.
So their buildings, their vehicles.
Right. Scope 2 includes the indirect emissions from the electricity or heating they buy.
The energy they consume.
And Scope 3, that covers all other indirect emissions that occur in a company's value chain, both upstream and downstream.
So upstream, we're talking about things like the goods and services they buy, how their supplies are transported.
Exactly.
And downstream, we're talking about things like how their products are used and disposed of.
And their investments.
Right. So a company's total carbon footprint can be much bigger than just what comes out of their own factories or offices.
Absolutely. Take an investment bank, for example. Their own direct emissions, Scope 1, and the emissions from the energy they buy, Scope 2, might be relatively small. But their Scope 3 emissions, coming from the companies they invest in, could be enormous. Ideally, organizations should measure and report all 3 scopes of emissions, covering all the key greenhouse gases.
Not just carbon dioxide.
Not just CO2.
Yeah.
And the ultimate goal here is to achieve and maintain net zero emissions before 2050 through those well-planned transition plans.
Now, net zero, that definition is still evolving.
It is.
But right now, it generally means reducing your emissions as much as possible and then using things like carbon offsets for those remaining emissions to reach a balance.
Precisely. And the market for those carbon credits, it's growing rapidly. But there's also a lot of uncertainty about future costs, regulations, how reliable different types of credits are going to be. All of that inherent uncertainty just reinforces how crucial risk management is for navigating this complex landscape.
This has been a truly deep dive.
Yes.
A complex topic, but incredibly important.
For sure. Just to recap quickly, we've talked about how vital risk management is for enabling sustainability, the nuances of materiality, and why we need to consider multiple perspectives, the urgency of tackling those emerging sustainability risks like climate change, the importance of a just transition that's fair for everyone, the need for genuine accountability that goes beyond just talking the talk, and those distinct yet related concepts of sustainability and resilience, all culminating in that critical TCFD framework and the central focus on cutting emissions.
We've covered a lot of ground. Hopefully for you listening, this has given you some valuable insights and aha moments without making your head spin. And so here's a final thought for you to ponder. Given that what's considered important in sustainability is constantly changing, and considering those long-term impacts of emerging risks, how should organizations keep adapting their risk management approaches to ensure they're not just addressing today's problems, but also preparing for the future? How can they anticipate those future challenges and opportunities as they strive for a truly sustainable future?
Great question.
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Keep exploring these important topics and think about how these insights apply to your own situation.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
We'll see you next time.